is our Lent series, 24 Hours That Changes the World. Today we're talking about the torture and humiliation of Jesus. And I'll be honest with you, I don't have any funny stories today. No funny videos. As I was thinking about this sermon, I realized something in my own life that I would like to share, and maybe you can identify with it. And Lent is a natural time to do this because Lent's a season of preparation for Easter. Easter's a celebration. Easter's joy and new life and resurrection and new possibilities and hope, and that's coming. But Lent is also a time to examine ourselves and to not be afraid to get down into the guts of life and to think about who we really are and our choices and how they affect us, how they affect other people, and to consider that stuff. And I'm the kind of person who likes to be entertained. I like to laugh. Somebody asked me this week what movies I like. And I think they were expecting something profound. I think they know me from one church or whatever. I'm like, Anchorman, Dumb and Dumber, right? That's the kind of entertainment I like. When I go to the movies, I want to laugh. I like listening to comedians. I like laughing. That's entertainment to me. I like things that make me feel good, that make me laugh, that give me a temporary sense of happiness. And that's just what I'm into. And I realize in my own life that I think the norm should be joy for life and happiness. And I hope you feel that way. And ultimately, life is good. But at the same time, there are seasons of life, there are times of life that should cause us to reflect. You know what I mean? I realize not every movie should be Anchorman. There are times when I should be willing to not hardy har, but to think about who I really am and what drives me and what's important to me and whether I do harm or I do good. And so this is an opportunity for that. This past week, we saw violence erupt at a political rally in Chicago. And people think it looks like the 1960s or it looks like 1930s. And we're just kind of in this weird time as a culture. So I heard another pop. You guys can hear me. Hey, here we are. There's a circuit box in the back room that I bet just got flipped. So we'll see what happens here. If the power goes out, I'm just gonna talk louder. Is that cool? Deal? The joys of portable church. But it's also as we heard in this last song, it's also true in our daily lives that we have these peaks and valleys. And a lot of times we don't like to spend time in the valleys. Even if we need to. Counselors know this. We like to go through something that's extremely painful in life and then a week later be over it. And that's completely lying to ourselves. And we understand how that works, that nobody likes pain. I met a lady one time, I led a grief class one time, several years ago. I met a lady whose adult son had committed suicide. And it had been 3 months prior. And she's like, I thought I'd be over it by now. Now, that's denial, it's a defense mechanism. Her brain is trying to protect her from the unspeakable pain and devastation of what she has experienced. We know that's what's happening in her psychologically, but it's also indicative of our culture, that we just want to be entertained, and we just want to be happy and hardy har all the time, even when it's really destructive, even when it's totally fake, actually. And it's just hard for us to spend time down in the difficult guts of life. And I realize that about myself. But we can't avoid that when we talk about a subject like what we're going to talk about today. And I just want to invite you, as we go through this, to think about your own pain that you feel as you're present, because we're all present still right here, right? After that prayer, we're all here. Whatever pain you feel, whatever loss you feel, think about those things and how this applies to that, how it can be comforting. And I also want us to think about something even harder. And this is just such a buzzkill. Such a buzzkill. I want you to think about, you ready for this? Pain that you've caused to other people. That's a way to get people to leave your church. I mean, we all want to feel good after church, right? I want you to, oh, what a horrible thing for a pastor to say. I want you to think about pain that you've caused. And I'm going to do the same thing. And as we consider the torture and the humiliation of Jesus, I want to invite you and me to think about what that shows to us about ourselves and how we can cause less pain in the future and also suffer less long-term pain if we're willing to go through some temporary pain in times of grief and sadness. How's that sound? Sound like a good time today? And you know what? In the long term, I think it does actually. There's short-term pain in something like this, but long-term, we're actually better off, aren't we? If we're able to grieve and feel pain, and if we're able to cause less pain and choose to do that intentionally, I think long-term, we actually do feel better and happier. And it really is good news. But it doesn't feel that way temporarily, but in the long term, we can be a lot happier. So we're just going to jump right in. There's my disclaimer, all the fine print, and we're going to jump in now. We have had 6 babies born in one church in like the past few months. 6 new, that's what I call church growth, right there, the best kind. 6 new babies. And when you see these little babies, and my wife is holding one right now, you see the innocence and the incredible, beautiful, pure, inspiring potential of human beings, don't you? They're sponges. They take in everything. They're learning. Their brains are just learning every nanosecond. And they're just so full of potential and goodness. And they're just crying out of pure need. They're completely dependent on other people. And if they receive love and they receive the care they need, they grow up to be wonderful people. And we see in that the beauty of the human heart. What is possible, our better angels, on this planet, and how great things really can be. Now, is that the full story of the human heart? Unfortunately not. I didn't show it just because it's creepy. Have you ever seen the baby photo of Adolf Hitler? There's a photo, you could Google it, Adolf Hitler baby, and delete your history after you do that too. You don't want anybody else to know you Google it. But it's this weird photo of this cute little baby. And it's Hitler. That little baby grew up to be Hitler. And it's just an odd experience to see that. It's that purity and that beauty and that innocence is not the full story of the human heart. And that's what's not fun to talk about. And that's where we're headed today. Do we always act with good intentions? We'd love to think so. Do we always have pure motives? We'd love to think so. Right? Do we always consider other people's needs as much as our own? Well, we'd love to think so. It's just not the case. So in a book entitled Machete Season by Gene Hetzfeld, he published his interviews of members of the Tutsi tribe and the Hutu tribe. And if you remember, in 1994, there was this just horrendous genocide in the African nation of Rwanda. From April to July 1994, after peacefully coexisting, the members of the Hutu tribe began systematically murdering members of the Tutsi tribe. And in that several-month period, they killed 1 million Tutsis. Now, DNA testing has shown there was no real difference between Hutus and Tutsis, by the way. It was just this incredible explosion of violence that caught the attention of the world. And so Hetzfeld interviewed 10 prisoners, Hutu prisoners, who had killed Tutsis with machetes. And here's what he found out. Here's what he heard from these people who, it's just unbelievable to us, right? Here's what he heard from them about how something like that happened. One of the killers said, one Sunday, we were singing in the same choir in church. And the next Sunday, we were hacking people to death. He said, what we did was, we decided that we were going to call Hutus names. And one of the names we called them was cockroach. And if we called them cockroaches, it was easier to kill them because they were no longer human. And we've heard that kind of thing before. They went deeper, though. He's like, this is a very churched culture, very, quote-unquote Christian culture. He said this went on for months. He's like, the pastors wouldn't talk about it. So he's like, people would go to work and then like take some part of the day off and kill people. And they'd go home and drink beer and play with their kids. And then on Sunday, the pastors wouldn't talk about what was happening because of fear. It was just something that didn't get talked about. This was happening, and it's just unbelievable to us, isn't it? This was happening to the extent that 1 million people were murdered. But it just wasn't talked about by people who should have talked about it in society. There were conversations that should have been had, but they weren't, because we all want to be entertained. And we all want to be happy, even if it's fake. Even if people are dying and we're doing sick things, we all want to act like we're happy. He's like, just nobody talked about it. They ignored the genocide and they compartmentalized their lives. Now, we think, if we're honest, a lot of us think, well, that was Africa, and that's called prejudice, right? That's looking down on a continent and writing something off because, that was them. Well, that happened in Central Europe in the 1930s. Things are getting really weird now in the United States. They've been weird here before. It's happened before. We're 5 miles from a Native American reservation right now. We're not immune from this. What does that tell us about the human heart? When I was talking about, I was joking about how this sermon is going to be such a buzzkill this morning before the service, and somebody was like, you know what? I think about that from time to time. Like, given the right circumstances, what am I really capable of? That's an honest person right there. That's a person who's willing to face the reality of the human heart. What does that tell us? Well, one thing we can learn is, because we're all human beings, if we don't think we're capable of evil, we're more likely to commit evil. If we want to live in denial and think that we always act with the best intentions and we never hurt anybody else and our actions don't affect anybody negatively, we are more likely to act in evil ways and to hurt and cause pain in other people's lives. One thing we can take away is the violence committed against Jesus forces us to look in the mirror. It forces us to look at who we really are, and it is not pleasant. It's not a fun Sunday morning, but it forces us to do that. All violence committed against anybody forces us to do that. Whether it's Chicago, or it's bullying in school, or it's this nasty, drag down argument between a married couple. All violence or violent words forces us to do that. It forces us to look in the mirror. On the morning that Jesus was crucified, a Friday, perhaps 8 a.m., he appeared before Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor installed by the Romans over this land of Palestine that the Romans occupied. And his one job was to maintain order. You do not let these people revolt, you maintain order. So Pilate ordered that Jesus be flogged and crucified. And that's where we're going to pick up the story. Mark chapter 15. The verses will be on the screen. Gospel of Mark 15. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them, as Josh talked about last week. Then he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him and twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They're mocking him. Again and again, they struck him on the head with a staff, spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. They're bowing down in a mocking way to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. It says, wishing to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released to them Barabbas. We're reading the story of Jesus and the people who were with Jesus, and we are eerily finding ourselves in this story. So a few weeks ago, we talked about how the disciples, on the night Jesus was betrayed, the Last Supper, they're arguing about which one's the greatest disciple. I'm the greatest follower of Jesus here, not you, right? And this massive facepalm, right? And then Jesus is betrayed by Judas. And then Jesus tells the people, his disciples who are with him in the garden, to kind of stay with him and be alert and watch, but they fall asleep while he's suffering alone. Have you ever felt alone, even when other people were with you? And then we find that Jesus is tried, and there are people who we know were sympathetic to Jesus who were there, but they didn't speak up because of fear. And so Jesus was treated in this way. And now Pilate, he wants to satisfy the crowd and satisfy the Romans and keep his job and just not let the peace be upset. And so he just goes with the flow. He just goes along with this torture and humiliation of another human being. So first, Pilate had Jesus flogged. Now, there's one line devoted to this. One line to the flogging of Jesus. If you're the one flogged, you know it's deserving of more than one line. So here's what flogging looked like. And I don't have any pictures. We're not gonna have graphic photos about it today, but I'm gonna describe it to you so we can feel it. When a person was flogged in, for example, under Hebrew law, like the Old Testament in Deuteronomy, a person could be flogged, but the limit that you could, flogging is whipping someone, the limit was 40 lashes. You can whip somebody 40 times. So in the ancient world, that's putting a limit on violence. It was actually progress for them. Now it would be barbaric to us. And so not wanting to break the law, the ruling leaders in that culture said, let's make it 39. And we won't go over 40 that way. If we lose count, we won't break the law. So a whipping in the Hebrew culture, a flogging, was 39 lashes. The Apostle Paul says he was flogged several times for preaching the gospel. But Jesus wasn't flogged by Jews. Jesus was flogged by Romans. And the Romans didn't have any such concerns about the limit of lashes that a victim could receive. 39, 40, 140, it didn't really matter to the Romans. Their goal was to inflict maximum punishment on the victim without killing them. That was the point of flogging. Because he's going to be crucified, and they want to spare his life so they can kill him in a more painful way. We want to beat this person almost to death so that we can kill them in a worse way. And this beating of the person almost to death will just make this other thing worse. So the victim was tied to a post, both arms around the post, stripped naked, and there were two guards called lictors on either side, and they used the flagellum, a whip. They each had one. Depending on the severity of the crime, they would load the end of the whip with objects, bone, metal, and it's not hard to understand what happened to somebody when these jacked Roman soldiers are just taking turns, wailing away on a human being. So the person's back, their buttocks, their legs, their arms, their rib cage, their neck, their everything, right? Everything's fair game. So whack, whack, whack. Time after time after time, the person collapses. Whack. Time after time after time. Would have obviously ripped through the skin. They could go through muscle. They could go to bone. Massive blood loss. The person's on the ground. Chains are holding them up. They're mocking and laughing the whole time. That's how this looked. Jesus was likely charged with insurrection. Remember the temple, when he turns over the tables in the temple? He's causing a riot there. And in Roman jurisprudence, he's overturning the society. And so we're not gonna have any mercy on this guy. And so we don't know how long this went on to Jesus Christ. But that's what flogging looked like. And flogging tells us something about the human heart, doesn't it? It's not the first or last time a person's been tortured in the history of humanity. Right? We've seen pictures of medieval torture devices. And even now in our world, that happens. We have a debate in our own culture. Ladies and gentlemen, where 65% of evangelical Christians think waterboarding's okay. Right? So we have this mirror that we look into as the human race, and we see ourselves inflict suffering on other people. Now, once again, it doesn't have to be flogging. It could be a desire for revenge. It could be bullying. It could be office politics, and where it's like a game of Survivor, and like there are alliances formed. and there are people who are cast out. I have a buddy of mine, his wife said back in junior high, her and her girlfriends every week would like pick one of the girls who would be like ostracized for the week. And they would all like ostracize her, and then the next week they let her back in and they pick a different girl. I mean, whatever, you know what I mean? That's just like that's like a teen movie or something. I don't get that stuff, but it's just the reality of human nature that stuff like this happens. You know, and cyberbullying, all this kind of stuff, to political rallies, to our own relational problems, and church gossip, and ostracizing people we think are different, right? I mean, it's just on and on and on and on. And so the torture of Jesus forces us to look into the mirror, but it also forces us to ask why God would allow this. If you're a thoughtful person, and you're like, well, if God's good, God's all-powerful. All the kids in children's church today? I see any kids around here, right? Why the hell would God allow this to happen in this world? Have you ever thought about that? Oh, he just cussed. He said hell in a way that wasn't referring to hell, right? And there are some people who get really offended by that, but they're not offended by these horrible things that happen in our world on a daily basis. We think if we're going to get offended, let's be offended about something worth being offended about, right? Can I get an amen on that one? And so we get, talking to myself too, we get comfortable here in the Southeast Valley of Phoenix. We don't even want to live near people who are in pain. It's what the suburbs are. Man, this is a way to kill a church, isn't it? Whew. Right? This guy right here, this guy knows how to grow a church from 150 to 100, right? And it's like, this guy's got the gift of church growth right here. And so there's just a lot we don't like to face about ourselves because we want to feel good, right? So it forces us to ask God, why would God allow this? I mean, there's the philosophical problem of evil. Why would God allow bad things happen to good people? I've dealt with that several times in sermons. I don't have an answer to my own satisfaction. You could go to onechurch.com and listen to me ramble for a really long time and then say, I don't know, all right? And then here, you know, in Christian theology, the question's been asked, why would God allow Jesus to go through this? And it gets to what's called the theory of the atonement, which is like a mashup of three words in Old English, at-one-ment. It means reconciliation. Two parties that were previously separated come together, and that's atonement. It's making that possible. Atonement is making reconciliation possible. And so there are people who have said, we'll just kind of talk about this quickly and then we'll move on. People who have said, well, Jesus went through all this because of what's called the substitutionary atonement. And what that means is that somehow Jesus was in our place, taking on the suffering for the sins of the human race. You probably all heard this. People who don't go to church hear this. Jesus died for the sins of the world. And the earliest Christians, they were familiar with the sacrificial system in Hebrew religion, and so this made sense in some ways to them. But there's this idea that somehow in the Middle Ages, it became called the penal substitution theory, like a law code. And it was a theory written by lawyers who understood the justice system. They said, well, here's maybe how it worked. God the Father was really mad at all the sin in the world. God's a wrathful God. God's mad at you. And what happened was Jesus, in the flogging and the crucifixion, took God's wrath. And so God the Father was really ticked, and God poured out his wrath on Jesus. And Jesus satisfied the wrath of God. And so now when God looks at you, he's not so mad anymore. He looks at the sacrifice of Jesus, and he's not mad anymore. And so Jesus took that wrath of God so you don't have to. And that now is still the dominant understanding of what it means to the atonement and how you become a Christian in the Southeast Valley. Are you tracking with me? Right? We don't want to just go straight to Nerdville on this one, but theologically, that's still the dominant thing you would hear around here in church in the Southeast Valley. Now, there are some problems with that, if we really want to think about it. It's disturbing to talk about, but this is a disturbing sermon, right? So we might as well. If you did something that, just made me furious. If you hacked me off so bad, I'm so mad at you. It's hard for me to say for obvious reasons. I'm so mad at you. What I'm going to do is have my son killed so I feel better about you. Okay. You follow me? Now, I get it. I get it, that's kind of the dominant understanding, but there's one problem. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense if we want to think about it in real world terms. And maybe there's some truth in that in the New Testament, that's fine. But it's been taken overboard. Another thing it does is it's good cop, bad cop on a cosmic level. So God the Father's really mad, and Jesus is cool and good. And we like Jesus, but we're scared to death of God the Father. But somehow it's okay, because somebody died. And it's just like, it's God kills Jesus, so he's not so mad at you. And if we get into this deeper, it's such a religion of fear. I mean, if you really think about what that means and what that says about God, it's really scary, actually. And so there is some substitutionary atonement in the New Testament. I'm not discounting that. At the same time, it's been taken too far. That's the point I'm making. And maybe there's more. And that's what leads us to the rest of the sermon before we wrap up. Another one's called the moral theory of the atonement. And that is that what Jesus was willing to go through as someone who suffered innocently shows us the horror of violence and pain and what the human heart really is capable of. It makes us look in the mirror, but it shows us the pain that causes. And then what that does is it invites us to get honest so that this is possible. We can see that suffering and we can have a change of heart. That we can be so moved by suffering and pain that is caused unjustly. It should have never happened. Things got out of hand. People were acting out of fear, out of prejudice, out of pride. And then this horrible thing happens. And now we're invited to look at this beaten, bloody mess and say, this should never happen again. And I don't want to play a part in something like this. Have you been there? Have you seen something? It could have been a relationship in your own life. It could anything where it's so nasty and it hurts. And you know what? I don't want to cause pain and suffering like this. And we have a change of heart. And we make a decision. We get intentional. And this is what it really takes. We get intentional about not doing harm, about not causing pain. We intentionally decide, because I see what can happen here, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to make sure. It's not enough to just go with the flow, because Pilate went with the flow. We know what happens when we go with the flow. It's not enough to just go with the flow. I'm going to intentionally decide that I'm not going to do harm. That doesn't mean I'm a perfect human being, but I'm working on it. I'm a work in progress. And when I'm invited, or when I'm faced with a decision about how I'm going to act, I'm going to look at the flogging of Jesus, the humiliation of Jesus, and I'm going to, as a follower of Jesus, and I'm going to see that bloody mess. And here's what happens when people are not intentional about doing the right thing, and I'm going to choose to do the right thing. I can have a change of heart. I told the story, it's been probably a couple of years ago. Many of you didn't hear it. When I was a freshman in high school, I lived out in the country, and I rode the cheese wagon to school every day, the big yellow cheese wagon. I rode the school bus to school. It was like an hour-long ride, as we're like going through all these country roads, picking up kids around the country. An hour every morning, an hour every afternoon. And about a quarter of the way through the bus route on the way home, so most of the kids were still on the bus, there was a 1-week period where things just descended into the Lord of the Flies. You ever read that book? Right? Where it's just like human beings descend into madness. So there was this kid who lived next to the trailer park. And a boy, I think he's about a year older than me. I think I was a freshman, he would have been a sophomore. And he had some effeminate mannerisms. And he sat maybe, 3/4 away towards the back of the bus. And so you've got most of the aisle to walk down in order to get off the bus at the front. And I don't know where, somebody started it, obviously, and it just went from there. So the kid gets up on this first day of this to walk down the aisle, and somebody starts chanting faggot. And some dude, And then a couple other voices join in. And so, like every other step that he's taking down this aisleway, he's hearing these boys yell faggot. And then some more voices join in. So on day one, by the time he gets to the door, it feels like half the bus is like chanting faggot at this guy. So he gets off the bus, dies down. Day two, it's more kids. It's getting louder. This went on, I think till Friday, Monday to Friday. By the end, you've got what feels like the entire busload of kids screaming faggot at this kid as he's walking down the aisle. Can you imagine how long that 20-foot aisle walk felt to that high school boy? Some of you can. Some of you can imagine. Now, I'm glad to say I didn't join in the yelling. I'm not glad to say I didn't do anything to stop it. I went with the flow. And then finally, the bus driver, after dropping him off, after a week of this, is like, you kids need to stop this. That would have been good on day one. A week of this. Can you imagine, he still remembers that, guys, right? He's told that story many times in his more honest moments about what happened to him in high school. Why does that happen? Why do human beings do that? But then the good news in such a buzzkill sermon like this is that we can see something like that and decide, that's whatever sick thing caused that to happen, I'm not going to be a part of that. As I've reflected on that, I think that has to have something to do with my own views and with this church. As I've thought about it, it wasn't the only thing, but it had to be one of many things that I experienced in my own life and was so disturbed by that and my lack of stopping that I had to look in the mirror and make some decisions about my own life and what it means to be a pastor in the Southeast Valley of Phoenix. You hear me? You feel what I'm saying? And so when we go through something like this, we're faced with this decision. Wait a second. Am I gonna go with this, or am I just gonna remain, in the middle, which is just as bad as going with it, really? Or am I gonna have a change of heart? And am I gonna do something about this? In 1863, there was a slave in South Carolina who was nearly beaten to death, and by his slave master. And an abolitionist took a photo of the man's scars. And he traveled around the North, showing this man's beaten body, a man who had been flogged, showing a photograph, this new thing called a photograph, showing this photograph to people around the North. And it was one of the things that really galvanized the abolitionist movement in the North when they saw with their own eyes, here's what happens to human beings. Here's the suffering that's happening here. Are we going to let this continue? Or are we going to choose to have a change of heart and do something about it? Fast forward almost 100 years, in 1955, a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till lived in Chicago. And he went to visit his cousins in Mississippi, and he stayed with a family member who was a preacher. And one day, he and his cousins went to the local grocery store, and his cousins double-dared Emmett to whistle at Miss Bryant, who was a 21-year-old, white woman who was the wife of the store owner. So they dared him to whistle, this 14-year-old African-American kid, they dared him to whistle at Miss Bryant, the white woman. And so he did. This isn't the picture that he's most famous for. This is a picture with Emmett Till and his mother, Mamie. I won't show you the picture he's more famous for, but you can Google it when you get home if you'd like. So 3 days later, Miss Bryant's husband, the store owner, and his half-brother, J.W., Roy and J.W., came to the preacher's house where Emmett was staying, and they abducted him, this 14-year-old boy. And they gouged out his eye, they beat him, they drove him from place to place, deciding what to do with him. They shot him in the head, and then they tied a farming implement to him and threw him in a body of water. His body was found there 3 days later, And his mother identified him by the ring that she gave him before he left to go on this trip to Mississippi, and it's a ring that had belonged to his dad. That's how she knew who he was. And the most famous thing was that during his funeral, his mother decided that she was going to have an open casket funeral. And that's the picture that I'm not going to show you. If you've seen that picture, you understand what that did to everybody who saw that picture, because they saw a 14-year-old boy's body maimed beyond recognition. They saw what had happened to a human being, somebody's son, because he whistled. Now, what should have happened to him was somebody should have said, hey man, you be respectful to Miss Bryan, knock it off and get out of the store. That's what should have happened to him. But what happened to him was so sick and beyond the pale of anything imaginable that should ever happen on planet Earth, that when the nation saw this open casket funeral of Emmett Till, it essentially kicked off the civil rights movement, or at least kicked it into a higher gear. Because it was such a wake-up call to the people who saw this photo of him, that this can't go on, and I can't let it go on. I have to intentionally choose that I'm not going to cause pain like this, and sitting on the fence is not good enough. I have to make a choice. I'm not going to do things like this, and I'm not going to let other people do things like this. That's the change of heart that we're talking about here. And when the early Christians wanted to make sense of Jesus' death, they went to the only scripture they had, which is the Hebrew Bible, which is what Christians call the Old Testament. It's most of what we now call, there it is, the Bible. There's the Hebrew scripture right there. They went to that. And one of the passages they went to was one of the Hebrew prophets named Isaiah, chapter 53. And when they read Isaiah after the death and suffering of Jesus, his flogging and humiliation, when the guards mocked him and put the purple robe on him and the crown of thorns to say he's worthless and make fun of him, and they read Isaiah 53, and they saw Jesus in that. And one of the lines is, he was despised and rejected, but by his wounds we are healed. By his wounds we are healed. That perhaps as a follower of Jesus, by seeing the suffering of Jesus, we see what happens when violence and fear and pride take their awful toll. And we decide we're going to have a change of heart. And maybe it's marriage. Maybe it's problems with other family members. Maybe it's work conflicts, school bullying. Maybe it's just the way we view other people, whatever other means to you. And we decide, however we navigate through life and relationships, reconciliation is not always possible. Sometimes people get divorced. Sometimes people cut off relationships. Sometimes you have to have boundaries. That's all true. You don't want to be abused. You get away from that. But we can also look and decide, I don't want to cause that kind of pain and that kind of suffering. I can have a change of heart. Right? And so I think in a very difficult sermon, that's a total buzzkill, and I completely understand that. This temporary pain of looking at the picture of the tortured and humiliated Jesus can cause such a change in our lives that it actually leads to longer-term joy. When we choose to do good instead of harm. When we choose to defend and not be drawn into alliances. And we choose to look at our own pain, too, in our own lives and grieve that and not pretend like we're fixed, when we're still grieving, and it's not true. But if we're willing to look at pain and go through the temporary pain of that, the grief of that, then we can have a change of heart and experience long-term healing and joy.